think that we can come today as our
those songs, just thinking about those in context of what we're talking about here, there's nothing more powerful than God. Nothing can stop His power, and that's going to be so evident as we continue on through our study. And pretty much from here on out, we're going to be headed more and more into the book of Revelation for a lot of what we're looking at. And what's the things that are coming? We talked last time about the next event. There's nothing else that has to happen from a prophetic standpoint. There's nothing else that has to happen from a biblical standpoint before the rapture happens. It is an event that could take place at any moment, and when it happens, it'll be instantaneous. It'll cause confusion. It'll cause chaos in the world for those who are left, and hundreds of millions of people are going to vanish from the planet instantaneously all over the world. And it will happen, like I said, instantaneous. It's going to cause a state of panic. It's going to cause chaos in the world. And it's going to set up the events of the tribulation that we're going to talk about. This time of great terror on earth. And it won't just be terror because what happened, we can't piece together what's happened. On top of that, God is going to bring severe judgment on the earth like has never been experienced before. Let's look at, I'm going to read to you a verse from Matthew 24, just to kind of give you the context of what we're heading into. Matthew 24:21 says, for then, I think, next slide here. For then there will be great tribulation, such has not occurred since the beginning of the world until now, nor ever will. Unless those days had been cut short, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short. And what Jesus is talking about here is just the magnitude and severity of this coming judgment and these events that will take place over this 7-year period called the tribulation. The majority of the book of Revelation is devoted to this 7 years of tribulation. And as I mentioned, it's a series of God's judgment, God's wrath.
What does the word tribulation mean?
It means to be. It's a weight. It's to be pressed. To be. Tribulation is the root word of that is a word that means to be pressed on, to be a weight on you that you may or may not be able to bear. And so there, tribulation comes to differing degrees. This is going to be great tribulation. So we're going to look at two things tonight. First one is the reason for the tribulation. What is God's reason for the tribulation? And then second thing we're going to look at is how did he show John what the tribulation was going to be like. So let's first of all look at God's reason for the tribulation. God's reason. And God has laid out a timeline that is specific to Israel. He showed this to Daniel in a vision. And this prophecy is related to two specific time frames in Israel's history. And Daniel was one of the Jews who was taken captive. You remember the story of the Babylonians coming in and taking over Jerusalem and all Judea. And they took it over. They took some of the prime young people, the smartest, the sharpest, first to kind of indoctrinate them into their way of life.
That was during the kingdom, during the reign of Hezekiah. Is that correct? I think it was Hezekiah.
I think it was after him, but I can't recall right now. But the nation of Israel was taken into captivity to a foreign land, hundreds of miles away. Daniel was probably 15 years old at the time. And he was taken into a foreign culture, foreign language, foreign food, foreign everything. He understood nothing of it. And God used him in a mighty way. And God spoke to him also. And God called him to some special tasks. And one of them was to address and to write down some of the visions that he was going to show Daniel. So, one of the prophecies that he showed him, he gave him the ability to understand dreams and to interpret that as a tool to open up his ability to speak for God's word. But he also showed him some visions and some pictures of things that were yet to come. And one of the things that he focuses on is how God is going to deal with Jews. Because Daniel was torn up because his people had been displaced from the land God promised them. They were no longer in the land. And he's torn up. The people are torn up because, okay, God, when are we going to go back? We know you disciplined us and you told us you would take us out of the land. If we didn't follow you, we didn't follow you. But when can we go back? Because we know you're faithful and you will bring us back to the land. And so God lays out a timeline, and this is a timeline that relates specifically to Israel. So in Daniel chapter 9, if you already turned there, I'm going to look at verse 24, and what he says is 70 weeks have been decreed for your people, for Daniel's people, or what nationality are they? Israelites. Okay, they're Jews. For your people and your holy city. What's your holy city according to for Daniel? Jerusalem is where the temple was. That's where they would go to worship, right? So, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and for your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end to sin, to atone for to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. So when it says 70 weeks here, it's talking about 70 periods of 7. And in the context, Daniel's been talking about things happening in year-long things, and given the context of the overarching context of God's words, he's talking about 70 periods of 7 years each, or a period of 490 years. Okay, so there's a 490-year specific prophecy that was given as a timeline for the nation of Israel. This is not prophecy of world events. This is not prophecy of future wars or even God's working in the church. This is specifically related to Israel and God's working with His people. So, by the time the 490 years is up, according to this, it's 70 weeks or 70 periods of 7 have been decreed. So that's 490 years. And by the time this is up, several things will have been accomplished. God tells 6 different things that will have been accomplished during this 490 years. And so God's going to work on some things related to Israel's sin, and He's going to has some future promises for Israel. So let's look at this verse here. The first one is 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and the holy city. First of all, to finish the transgression. To finish the transgression. Israel's history of rebellion. By the end of this prophecy, Israel's history of rebellion against God will be brought to an end. Okay, you read through the Old Testament. How did the Israelites do? We just went through the life of Moses. How were the Israelites in their relationship to God? It was pretty iffy, wasn't it? It was a roller coaster ride, okay? God, you're the greatest thing. Where's my water? I hate you, God. Why did you bring me out here to die? Okay. Yeah, exactly. Where's my onions? I want to eat onions again.
I want the cucumbers.
And so the first thing is he wants to, God said, by the end of this period, the transgression will be finished. The second thing he says right after that, he will make an end of sin. The judgment for Israel's sin will be carried out. So the judgment for Israel's sin will be atoned for one, but also they will have paid the penalty that is required of their sin. Third, to make an atonement for sin. This is Jesus' sacrifice that would pave the way for them to have a right relationship with God. Will take away their sin forever, rather than the sacrifices which in the Old Testament covered their sin for a short time. There's a covering of sin in the Old Testament. There's the removal of sin for Jesus Christ. So those first three things deal with Israel's sin and how God's going to deal with that before this 490-year period comes to an end. The last three deal with promises for Israel's future that will be fulfilled when Jesus comes to rule and reign on the earth for the 1,000 years. This is what the Jews were looking for in Jesus' day. They were waiting for him to take over and to rule and to be king and to take charge of everything. He will do that. It just wasn't in the timing that they expected. So let's look at these last three things that God's going to accomplish that is in this one verse here. He's going to bring everlasting righteousness. So just going through this verse, what is this verse telling us is going to happen in this 70 periods of 7 years? He's going to bring everlasting righteousness. There's going to be an age that's characterized in Israel's history by righteous living. How cool is that? We haven't read about that yet in the Bible. You go through the whole Old Testament, starting with Abraham, you keep reading all the way through Jesus' life. You don't see that. But that's coming. That's one of the things God's going to accomplish. He's going to seal up vision and prophecy. Basically, all God's promises for Israel are going to be fulfilled. Those things that the Jews of Jesus' day that they were looking forward to, they will be accomplished by the end of this 490-year period. And lastly, to anoint the most holy place. There will be a dedication of the temple that will be used to worship God. So as we look at Israel, it's clear that these promises have not been fulfilled. You look at Israel now, it's not a nation without sin. You look at Israel now, they're not living in a period of righteousness and peace. They're living in anything but that, aren't they? They're the brunt of the world's attacks, it seems like. So it's clear that the 490 years, these 70 periods of 7 years, are not complete yet. Okay, so it's very evident of that. Let's keep on reading in Daniel, verse 25 of chapter 9. This leads us to where we're going to be tonight. And so God had this plan from long before Jesus' life on earth. This is 600 years before Jesus was born, approximately. So you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until the Messiah, the Prince of Peace, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. 7 periods of 7, 62 periods of 7. Okay, so let's do some quick math. 7 plus 62 equals
69.
Thank you. Okay, very good. So 69. Okay, that's 483 years that are being covered in this first verse here. Should we try again? 7 plus 62.
3.
Just wanted everyone to go. So here's what he's doing is he's breaking down this period of 490 years as to what's going to happen. When does it start? When does it pause? What will it be like when it resumes? So there's going to be this period of 69 weeks. And that's spelled out in verse 25. Then, after 62 weeks, the Messiah will be, then after the 62 weeks, so there's a period of 7, 62, then after the 62, Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. And its end will come with a flood, even to the end. There will be a war, desolations are determined. And he will make a firm covenant with many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he will put a stop to the sacrifice and grain offering. And on the wing of the abomination will come the one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction. One that is decreed, it is poured out on the one who makes desolate. Okay, so there's some things in there that we can kind of pick up, and some things that are a little bit confusing. Okay, so let's start with, let's do the onion principle. Let's take the outer layers. Let's understand this bit by bit. Because if you peel back the outer layer, then there's another layer that you can kind of understand that. So we're going to take it piece by piece. And I tried not to cram too much content in it tonight so we could go through it and try to help you understand what's going on. So the first 69 periods of 7 years is 483 years. Okay? It's easier to do 490 minus 7 rather than 69 minus 7. It's the easier math. So 483 years. When does this begin? When does this begin? It starts with what event? He tells us in verse 26. Then after the 62 weeks, verse 25, I'm sorry. From the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. That's the starting point of this 490-year period. Okay, so that's the beginning point. From history, we know that on March 14th, 444 BC, Artaxerxes, who was the king of the Persians at that time, who took over. Okay, the Babylonians captured Israel. Babylonians were taken over by the Medes. The Medes were taken over by the Persians. So the Persians are now the adoptive parents of these captives. And the king at that time decides, I want you to go back. And he gives them permission to build the temple. Finally, he gives them permission on March 14th, 444 BC. He gives them a written decree allowing them to go back and rebuild the walls of the city of Jerusalem. He gives them that permission. And you can read about that in Nehemiah chapter 2 if you want to jot a cross-reference down there. Nehemiah chapter 2. So he gave that permission. And so that's 444 BC. Verse 25 mentions a period of 7 weeks or 7 periods of 7. How many years is that?
Say it again.
7 periods of 7.
That's 49.
49, okay. I'm just trying to make sure you're still awake in the kids here. Not really math class, but just trying to keep you connected here. And most scholars believe that is the time frame of that it would take from the beginning of the issuing of the decree until the city is reestablished, as it said here, till it's restored, till it's rebuilt, until it's functioning again. That 49-year period is approximately that. And so that's why it's broken up into the 7 and 62. 62 weeks is 434 years, and it's the time that immediately follows. And there's a definite end point to this 434-year period. And that end point is 62 weeks, and it will be built again, the plaza and moat, and even in times of distress. And so, it's not going to be easy times, but there is going to be this time frame that it will be built, and it goes into the detail of the plaza and moats and all that kind of stuff. Then, after the 62 weeks, what will happen? The Messiah will be cut off. The Messiah will be cut off. So verse 26 indicates that the end of this period, this 7 and 62, the end of this period is when the Messiah is cut off. So the 69 69 weeks of years. Okay, so it's 483 years. Let's put it in that term. After 483 years, the Messiah will be cut off. The ancient calendar, now, we're looking at things from our calendar, and so we're looking at 444 BC and Jesus' life and everything. But the ancient calendar had a 360-day year rather than a 365-day year. And so as you apply the calendar of the ancient times that Daniel would have used, that this culture would have used, you arrive at the total days is 173,880 days. Okay, 173,880 days. You take from the day that the decree was signed to rebuild the walls till the day that Jesus entered Jerusalem riding on the donkey, his triumphal entry. 173,880 days. Jesus, or God had predicted, God had planned to the day this time frame. He's given Israel 483 years back in the land with their city restored, with their city rebuilt, with the temple functioning, with everything going on, to turn back to Him. And then at the end of this time frame, not only did He give them this time to turn back to Him, He sent His Son, the promised Messiah. What has been their response during this time? They rejected God. They turned away from God. They turned to idols. They lived like the world around them. The Messiah comes. They have a passing interest in Him, but they reject Him. This 483-year period ends with Jesus' triumphal entry, and then it says after this 62 weeks, after this, He will be cut off. That Jesus enters Jerusalem on Sunday. Who knows what happens on Friday that week? He's crucified. Who sentences Him? Who pushes for His crucifixion?
The Pharisees?
Well, yeah, for the Jews, the Pharisees are pushing the Jewish leadership. And so He's rejected. He will be cut off. So that covers the first 69 periods of 7 that take place. And then there's a gap. And we're living in that gap right now. That gap ends when the Messiah is cut off, and then it will resume again. But God shows us through this that He's not finished with Israel. He's not done with Israel. He's going to judge and restore Israel in that 70th week. Because all those things, remember all those things in Daniel 9:24 that said will happen before the end of this 490 years? We've gone through 483 of those years, and it hasn't happened yet. If you take God at His word, during this 7-year period, God's going to do and complete all those things that He promised He would do. And so, I grew up as a young Christian understanding that there would be a tribulation, but I never thought to ask the question, why will there be a tribulation? Why? Why is God doing this? Yeah, He can. Yeah, He's powerful enough. Yeah, it's pretty impressive to read about the Bible, what He's going to do. But why is God going to do that? 3 purposes of the tribulation. They're pretty clear in Scripture. One is to purify Israel. One is to purify Israel. Let me read you from Romans chapter 11. There it is. Romans 11. Romans 11 basically is the chapter that says God isn't done with Israel. Don't give up on Israel. Verse 26. The deliverer will come from Zion. He will remove ungodliness from Jacob. This is my covenant with them when I take away their sins. And it starts off, and so all Israel will be saved, just as it is written. Israel will be saved. God isn't done with Israel. And Paul goes on later in this chapter to talk about the gifts and calling of God are irrevocable. What God has called Israel to, he hasn't backed down on. He's not done. So why this 7 years of tribulation? To purify Israel. Those in Israel who are rebellious. And that's been a majority of Israel throughout their history. A majority of their leadership throughout their history. Those who are rebellious will be purged. And God will establish Israel as a righteous people. So first thing is he's going to do is purify Israel. Second thing he's going to do, and Nahum talks about this in Nahum chapter 2, he's going to judge sin and wickedness. Actually, it's Nahum chapter 1. He's going to judge sin and wickedness. Not just of Israel, judge sin and wickedness on a large scale. Listen to Nahum 1, verses 2 and 3. About God's wrath, God's judgment. A jealous and avenging God is the Lord. The Lord is avenging and wrathful. The Lord takes vengeance on his adversaries, and he reserves wrath for his enemies. The Lord is slow to anger and great in power, and the Lord will by no means leave the guilty unpunished. That will be a terrifying truth for so many in our world today. The Lord will by no means leave guilty unpunished.
Scariest thing to hear is, "Depart from me, ye cursed, into the eternal fire prepared for the devil and his angels."
Exactly. And that's part of what he's talking about here. It goes on in verse 3. In a whirlwind and storm is his way, and clouds are the dust beneath his feet. So he's going to bring judgment to sin. He's going to bring judgment to wickedness. And then to completely turn the perspective on things, what else is he going to accomplish? There's going to be preaching of the gospel. Preaching of the gospel. How many of you equate the preaching of the gospel with the tribulation period? That's not the first thing we think of. We think of plagues of locusts and the sun turning red and people, the death of
Dogs and cats living together, mass hysteria.
Exactly. Revelation chapter 7. Revelation chapter 7 talks about the fact that during the tribulation, we'll get into this more later, but during the tribulation, from the 12 tribes of Israel during that time, God will take 12,000 witnesses of his from each tribe. There will be 144,000 Jewish witnesses on the planet spreading the gospel. They will be their full-time job, their full-time passion in life will be to share the gospel. You think of someone you know that loves to talk about Jesus with anyone they can. Now multiply that times 144,000, and they're just going everywhere, doing it all the time. It's really cool to see the response to that in Revelation. Sorry. There we go. Verse 9, Revelation 7:9. So it talks about these 144,000 from every tribe, and here's the response. After these things I looked, John's saying, he's giving his perspective on what's happened. He talks about these witnesses, their mass push to share the gospel with every person on the planet that they can. After these things I looked, and behold, a great multitude, which no one could count, from every tribe, or from every nation, and all tribes, and peoples, and tongues, standing before the throne, for the Lamb, clothed in white robes, palm branches were in their hands. And they were crying out in a loud voice, saying, Salvation to our God who sits on the throne and to the Lamb. Jump down to verse 13. How do we know that's referring to these people that are witnessed to by these 144,000 from the tribulation? John is having a conversation with an angel. Verse 13. Then one of the elders answered to me, saying, These who are clothed in white robes, who are they? And where have they come from? So the angel is asking John this. And John's like, I don't know. He didn't say that. He said, My Lord, you know. And he said to me, These are the ones who come out of the great tribulation. They have been washed, their robes have been made white in the blood of the Lamb. For this reason, they are before the throne, and they serve him all day and night in his temple. He who sits on the throne will spread the tabernacle. They will hunger no longer, nor thirst no more, nor will the sun beat down on them, nor any heat. For the Lamb in the center of the throne will be the shepherd. He will guide them to springs of water of life, and God will wipe away every tear. That context of their change of circumstance is going to have a whole lot more meaning as we look at the specific events in the coming weeks of the tribulation. But the gospel will be spread. 144,000 bold, well-equipped, unashamed witnesses are going to share the gospel. And it says in verse 9, I couldn't even count how many people they had reached that were standing before the throne worshiping God. Over in Revelation chapter 11, it tells us there's two witnesses that are prophets from God that are given power from God who will boldly, on the world stage, with kind of the world looking at them, will boldly share the gospel. People will love them and follow that message. People will hate them and want them dead and celebrate when they are killed. Because their message is so polarizing. You either trust Christ or you face the judgment. So let's take a look at the timeline. So we're in this time of the church. We're in this time where we're between Daniel's 69th week ends right before this chart starts. 69th week ends there. This is Daniel's 70th week here. We're living in that in-between stage. We're the church. We're the ones who have been called for this season to reach the world. We're the ones who have been called for this season, for this time, to make an impact on the world, to prevent as much of the world as possible from entering this 70th week of Daniel, this time of tribulation. Yes, there's going to be tons of people, probably millions of people who trust Christ during this time. It is so much better to trust Christ now, because these people will pay such a high price, every single one of them. They will live such a difficult life because of their choice. The 7-year period turns the focus from, the focus was on Israel. And the Messiah that came from the tribe of Judah. And God's purpose to reach Israel, but their rejection of the Messiah. And so through the book of Acts, we see that God begins bringing the gospel to the Gentiles. God brings the gospel to the world. That's the point we're at now. And in this time of tribulation, God's going to bring the focal point back to Jerusalem. Because here's what's going to happen between this purplish one here and the blue one here. In an instant, the entire church worldwide is going to vanish. There will be no church entering the tribulation. Tribulation's about Israel. So let's look at the second thing here, God's revelation of the tribulation. Here's what I want to do is kind of give us a little intro to the book of Revelation and how we can kind of get some context for it. So now we're going to, from here on out, we're going to start turning our attention toward the events and things that are going to happen during this 7-year period. Revelation chapter 6 through 18. So there's 13 chapters of Revelation that cover this 7-year period of history. So 13 chapters, more than half the book of Revelation is assigned to this 7-year period, basically. So this prophecy that we read in Revelation, if any of you have read through Revelation, you probably at one point or another scratched your head a little bit. What did I just read there? What's that about? I promise you're not going to have every question answered. Seriously. Probably have more questions than you had coming in. And that's a good thing, because that will make you seek out more answers, right? So that's a good thing. So we're not going to pretend to try to answer every question. Because first of all, I don't know most of the answers. Honestly. It's a book that's given to us so that we can know that God's in control, so that we can know God's plan, so that we can know God's mercy, know God's wrath, so we can know a lot of things. There's 3 primary ways people interpret the book of Revelation. Okay, 3 primary ways. The first one is some interpret it allegorically. If something doesn't come right out and say it's an allegory, it's dangerous to interpret it, especially God's word, as an allegory, because essentially you're taking away any literal meaning of it. And you're saying everything's just a picture, and from my interpretation, all the pictures mean this and this and this.
It's dangerous to dogmatically say that it's just an allegory.
What's that?
I would argue it's dangerous to just dogmatically say that it's an allegory and not leave the possibility that it could be literal.
Okay. So some say it is an allegory, and they begin assigning meanings to different things. And so when it says there will be 3.5 years of this, that doesn't really mean 3.5 years, and it doesn't really mean it's of that. It just means it's going to be something kind of bad. And so everything just kind of is a picture of something else, and it kind of becomes nondescript. An allegory works if you have a context for how to interpret, and if you're told it's an allegory. If you decide to interpret something as an allegory that wasn't written as an allegory, you're going to come up with something completely different than the original author intended. Okay, so pick up several of your reading books tonight before we started. So, what if someone took your book and started reading it allegorically? Oh, this doesn't really refer to a husband and wife. This is referring to Yeah, and you just start reassigning things to a very literal story. It's like, well, that isn't anything.
Well, that makes no sense.
Yeah, well, that's not what the story's about. That's what some people do, God's word, because here's what it does. It takes it out of the realm of impacting my life, of bringing conviction on me, because I can distance myself from it by making it a story that I don't have to be accountable to. So that's the first way. Second way, historical. Some think this is a history book of everything that has already happened. Some would say there, as I think I mentioned last time, there is no rapture. The Bible pretty clearly states that there is. It's pretty clear that that's an event yet to come. Some say that the tribulation has already happened, and because they kind of give it some picturesque meanings, it was a tough time for Israel back in the first century, and they've gone through that, and now we are living in the millennial kingdom where Jesus is ruling and reigning. Aren't y'all thrilled to be living in the kingdom where Jesus is ruling and reigning? Isn't this great? Doesn't this feel just like Jesus would run things?
No.
If this is the best Jesus can do, I think there's a problem.
I'm questioning my faith if that's the case.
Exactly. I would agree with you. Right? If that's the case, wait, did I get sold a bill of goods here? Did I get it? I got
Was I conned? I think I was conned.
Yeah. So some would say that this is as good as it gets, basically. This is where it all ends. But I don't know. I give up, right? I got nothing to be excited about anymore.
Grace pain.
So let's come up with a third way to interpret it, and that is a literal interpretation, which is the appropriate way to approach Scripture. Not every passage in the Bible is literal, but we should approach Scripture in a literal term. And so when a poetic passage is given to us, we should interpret it as poetry. When an allegory is presented in Scripture as part of a point, we should interpret it as an allegory, but we put all that in the context of a literal interpretation. And if we do that, we see that the events primarily in the book of Revelation, at least beginning with chapter 4 and all the way through the end, are future events that have not yet happened. Okay, and so that's the perspective that we're coming from. That's the perspective that we're looking at this book from. So God chose to reveal himself. He chose to reveal this future timeline to John in a vision while John was a prisoner on the island of Patmos. The island of Patmos was kind of like a prison camp that John was sent to because he shared the gospel and he wouldn't stop. So he was sent to this island, this remote island that you can't get off of, that becomes essentially the worst of the worst. And did you just say Alcatraz? Yeah, exactly. Yep. And so it's this small little island that you just get sentenced to, and you end up dying there.
You know, something interesting I've noticed is that when people will criticize Christianity and say that the 12 disciples were just power-hungry men, and I think, really? Because all 12 of them died a pretty horrific death, and I don't think you would do that for something that's fancy.
Nope, exactly. That's one of the good arguments for it. So let's look at Revelation chapter 4, verse 1, because this is the point at which this revelation of these things that is going to happen begins. And at this point, John's perspective is changed. Yes?
So, I'd be jumping in with, interpret them literally. Do you mean also, like I'm thinking of, like, the locusts coming and, like, that stuff. Do you mean to interpret that, like, literally? Or?
Not necessarily.
So
because there's some picturesque words and terms and descriptions.
Hyperbole, basically.
So you can't believe there's, like, giant locusts or, like...
It's hard to know what they are.
Yeah.
It's hard to know what they are because And I'm going to get to that.
Well, we have fossilized proof of giant arthropods and insects.
I'm going to tell me. I'll check back with you when we get in just a couple minutes. See if this helps. Okay. So Revelation 4:1, and then we'll get back to Savannah's great question there. After these things, this is John's perspective. This is what John wrote. After these things, I looked, and behold, a door standing open in heaven. And the first voice which I heard, like the sound of a trumpet speaking with me, said, "Come up here, and I will show you what must take place after these things." So, from Revelation 4:1, that door of heaven is opened. John is ushered into the presence of heaven, and he sees everything from the perspective of heaven. And that's the rest of the book of Revelation, is from that perspective. So John is a human with human context, human vocabulary, human understanding, brought into the context of heaven. And shown so much that he has trouble comprehending it. He has trouble expressing all that God is showing him. So three words of wisdom, and this is, I think, going to kind of touch on Savannah's question here. 3 words of wisdom in helping you understand Revelation. Everything doesn't necessarily mean what you think it means. There are things here that are obvious word pictures. Everything doesn't mean what you think it means or what you want it to mean. There was a problem when Jesus was on earth. They thought they had a handle on the prophecies regarding the Messiah. They thought they had it down pat, and they rejected the Messiah because they were so sure of themselves. They missed what they were looking for because they were so sure. As you go through the book of Revelation, we're looking at things that we don't have a context to understand because it's never happened before in history. Remember, we read that to start off? Nothing like this has ever happened before, so there's no way to measure it. No way to quantify it. Back in the 1930s, the church at large was convinced that Adolf Hitler was the Antichrist, that Stalin was the false prophet. And as time moved forward, the church, as in large numbers, were disillusioned because they were so convinced of this one interpretation of the facts that when it didn't come to pass, when Hitler died, Stalin died, and that was the end of it. Now what? I put all my faith in this interpretation of this. So be careful in being dogmatic, being too sure of your interpretation. Let's be realizing the struggle John had to communicate. That leads us to the second thing. John uses limited vocabulary and experience to try to describe all that happens. I think this is kind of, this is what I'm thinking might kind of help address your question, Savannah. So he's a human, and he has a perspective of a person who's lived only in the first century. So that's the entire context of his perspective. He's seeing things that are spiritual and go far beyond anything that he's ever experienced, that anyone's ever experienced. It's like George Washington steps into the room tonight and somebody says, "Look at this on my phone." And you start going through your phone, showing him all the things your phone can do. Then he's transported back in time. And he's trying to tell the founding fathers, "I saw this thing that was really cool. Explain it to us, George." I don't know how. We don't have words to explain. It was so cool. But I don't know. It connects to the internet. What's the internet? Well, you plug it in and charge it. What do you mean charge it? There's no context. There's no perspective to even begin to explain what's there. And that's the struggle we see John facing here, because he's using his limited perspective, his limited vocabulary. So George Washington's going back and he's like, "Hey, y'all remember Paul Revere, 1 by land, 2 by sea? This is just like that, only way cooler, okay? He used that to communicate to everybody, but this is like a step above. No, a couple steps above the lanterns and power, okay? He's got such limited perspective. So when you read about the locusts, is that airplanes? Is that helicopters? Is that something else that we don't even know about? What kind of word would John have used to describe a fighter jet or a bomber?
A metal bird. That's probably what they would call it. A metal bird.
I don't know. Yeah, that could be. But just presenting the context or the challenge there. Does that kind of give some perspective to what you're asking there? So a lot of it we're going to have a hard time figuring out, and I don't think we're going to come up with the answer.
They're like, it's all drones.
It's all
drones.
Yeah, very true.
They probably call
And
it
even
submarine.
when you were kids, drones wouldn't have even made any sense to you. Yeah,
You're like,
you'd be like, what?
Robots.
So third thing. So first off is that everything doesn't mean what you think it means. Second, John has a very limited vocabulary, very limited perspective. Third, he writes with this circular perspective. And a guy I know just recently taught through the book of Revelation. And here's the picture he gave. And I love this because these are kind of some of his points. And the picture he gave of this was, have you ever gone into one of those places where there's a 360-degree movie going on? And so you can go in and you can see the movie all around you. And there's different stuff happening back here and over there. And there's sounds coming from everywhere. And there's different stuff happening. That's a movie. Imagine that being real life in heaven. Things are happening all around him. And he's working and he's grasping at ways to describe it. And he sees something over here and he's like, I got to describe that too. So as we go through, things may not be sequential. They won't be sequential necessarily because John's looking here and there and he turns around and this is happening and then this is going on over here. And so things don't necessarily fall into sequential order. So those are a couple things that will hopefully help give you some context of how to read the book of Revelation. Not that we're not going to try to understand it, but let's understand what God's at work doing. Yes.
So are the angels with 7 trumpets in order? Or?
Yes. Yeah, those are in order. He goes through the first trump, second trump, and the seals and the bowls and the trumpets, that's all in order. Because those are numbered things. But we'll see something here and there that is kind of a. Let me take a sidebar here and tell you about this or that. But as he's going through an account, you can tell it's an orderly account. So the main message of the book of Revelation is the world we live in is really bad. And it's going to get worse. It's going to get worse. And then it's going to get way worse. That's basically Revelation. What's bad, worse, and then Jesus. That's Revelation in a nutshell for you. God's told us these things for a couple reasons. One, so we can be ready. 2, so we can help others be ready. So we can understand the severity of sin. So we can understand the extent of God's mercy. So we can understand His faithfulness to Israel, to fulfill His promise that He made to Abraham, to fulfill the promises that He made all through there. So during the next several weeks, we're going to take several weeks. I was initially thinking, let's do the tribulation in 2 weeks. And I started studying it. I tried to pare it down tonight so I wouldn't overload y'all, but I feel like I overloaded y'all.
I mean, it's already 8:40.
Yeah, I know. And so try to keep it small bites, but it's hard, man. So the next several weeks, we're going to look at the events of the tribulation. We're going to look at the people who are the main people that are associated and that will be notable during the tribulation. There's several different people that will rise to levels of prominence and have a key role in the tribulation. So that's where we're headed. This week, two things for you. Don't be afraid of the tribulation. Trust in Christ. There's no reason to fear all these things that are coming because Christ is victorious over death. Christ is victorious over sin, and He's promised to bring us deliverance. But the flip side of that is do fear the tribulation for those people in your life who do not trust in Christ yet. Because it's going to be the worst time of history. Second, express thanks to God for being so precise about His timeline. It shows that God is in control. He was precise down to the day, from the day the decree went that Jerusalem should be rebuilt to the day that Jesus entered Jerusalem. He was precise. So therefore, because He's so precise, trust Him for the future. God, I thank You for trust. You have faith. You have confidence because of our relationship with You, because of Your blood that has washed us, that promises us resurrection, eternal life. We can have hope. So God, I just ask You, burdens for those. I ask You, help us